Okay, let's dig into this. We've got quite a pile of material here, articles, reports, all focused on the 2025 G7 summit up in Canada.
Yeah, and reading through it, the first thing that really jumps out is this stark contrast the sources are painting.
How so?
Well, you got the visuals right. World leaders, picturesque Canadian landscapes, projecting this image of calm, of control.
Mm-hmm.
But then the backdrop, as described in these papers, it's anything but calm. Ongoing wars, shaky economies, a global situation that feels, frankly, pretty chaotic.
Right. And that sets up the main argument we see running through all this material, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The idea that these G7 summits, year after year, they function more like a big show, grand statements, lots of promises.
But maybe not always the place where the really tough global problems get solved. The sources keep pointing to this a gap between the talk and the actual results.
It's that tension, isn't it? These are powerful nations, huge economic players, and the sources are asking basically, are they really using that power effectively, given how messy the world looks?
So that's our mission for this deep dive then. To really unpack this material, look at the specific examples the sources use to critique the G7 in 2025.
And see what it tells us, maybe more broadly, about these big international meetings when things feel so unstable.
And importantly, this isn't just high-level politics happening somewhere else. The material really tries to connect it back to, well, to you, listening.
Yeah, they make a strong case that when these leaders meet, and especially when the sources argue, they fall short on things like conflict or climate or trade, it actually ripples out.
It does. We're talking impacts that can hit your daily commute costs, your grocery budget, even the sort of planet we're leaving behind. So, okay, let's get into the world situation as these sources describe it leading up to that 2025 meeting.
They don't mince words. The material calls the global situation a mess. Just straight up. Wars raging, economies wobbling.
A pressure cooker environment, I think was the phrase used.
That's the one. And they pinpoint key events driving that pressure. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, starting February 2022, that's framed as a massive shock.
And then the Israel-Palestine conflict flaring up again in 2023. These aren't just history lessons. The sources say these are the active crises coloring everything.
Definitely. And against that backdrop, you have the G7, the US, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Canada coming together.
With an agenda that sounds familiar.
Very familiar, according to the sources.
Yeah.
Promises of peace, prosperity, a greener planet.
Yeah.
But the way it's presented here, it feels less like fresh goals and more like a script they pull out each year. Recycled promises.
The sources mentioned the 2025 summit was sort of billed as a reset, right? A chance for better global cooperation.
It was.
Huh.
But the blunt take from this material is that it pretty quickly became what they term a masterclass in posturing.
Ouch.
Yeah. And that posturing, as the sources see it, has real costs. When this group, with all its power, seems unable to actually curb conflicts.
It hits things like oil prices. Your commute gets more expensive. Anything eating fuel costs more. That's a direct link the sources make. And it's not just conflicts. They argue when the G7 just bickers over trade policies, that adds to supply chain snarls, makes your groceries pricier.
And the big one, maybe climate change. If they're seen as dodging real action, the sources are clear. That impacts the planet's future,
Yeah.
your future, everything from weather patterns to basic resources.
Okay, let's get specific. The Ukraine war. The sources spend a lot of time here. Since 2022, the G7's main response, as laid out in this material, was sanctions on Russia, right? Trying to hit their economy hard.
That was the strategy. But this is where the sources really push back. They argue pretty directly that the sanctions haven't worked as planned.
And they back that up.
They do. They point specifically to the IMF's 2024 World Economic Outlook. And according to that report cited here, Russia's economy didn't collapse. It actually grew in 2023.
Grew, despite the sanctions.
Yeah, and the projection for 2025 mentioned in the sources was that it might even outpace growth in some G7 countries.
Wow. So how did Russia manage that, according to this material?
Several things mentioned. Boosting ties with China, finding new markets for its oil, particularly non-Western countries, not enforcing the sanctions.
And keeping the ruble relatively stable. So basically finding ways around the pressure.
Exactly. Mitigating the impact. But the sources also note the ripple effects elsewhere. Europe's still dealing with sky-high energy bills because they've moved off Russian gas.
And developing nations, like India mentioned here, caught in a bind and needing affordable energy, but also navigating complex diplomacy.
Right. So, faced with sanctions not quite working as hoped, what did the G7 do in 2025? The sources say, kind of dryly, More sanctions, of course.
Plus a big aid pledge for Ukraine, $50 billion.
$50 billion, yeah. But the sources immediately put that number in perspective.
How so?
They compare it to the estimated reconstruction costs for Ukraine, which are cited as being over $400 billion. So $50 billion. The analogy used is like tossing a Band-Aid at a broken leg.
Significant money, but maybe not meeting the scale of the need. And for you listening, the sources link this directly back. That turbulence in energy markets, higher costs at the pump, general economic instability from the conflict, that grocery bill that makes you wonder if carrots are now a luxury item.
And crucially, the human cost. Millions displaced, lives lost. The material suggests that despite the G7's efforts, peace felt no closer after the 2025 summit.
Okay, let's shift to another crisis point highlighted, Gaza. The sources paint a really grim picture following the conflict's escalation in 2023.
Describing Gaza as reduced to rubble. They cite UN figures over 40,000 civilian deaths, massive infrastructure damage, just devastating.
And at the 2025 summit, the G7 leaders, they made vows, pledges.
Yeah, vows to support reconstruction, push for a ceasefire, the usual diplomatic language.
But the critique in the material is pretty scathing here, isn't it? Calling those words as hollow as a politician's campaign promise.
It is sharp. And they give examples of what they see as hypocrisy. The U.S., for instance, calling for peace while still providing major military aid to Israel.
The sources use that analogy, like handing someone a flamethrower and then asking them to put out a fire.
A powerful image. And they also look at other G7 members, like France and Germany, issuing statements, yes, but avoiding tougher actions, like halting arms sales or pushing hard for UN sanctions, attributed to, geopolitics.
The result, as described here, continued suffering in Gaza, rebuilding expected to take decades, aid stuck in bureaucratic limbo.
And the sources connect this wider instability, too, fueling migration issues, spiking food prices globally, raising tensions that could pull others in.
There's even a cynical note suggesting G7 talk of reconstruction might sometimes be about future contracts for their own companies.
Yeah, that's in there. It's a tough assessment.
Okay, let's pivot again. Climate change. Always on the G7 agenda. The sources say they've been banging the climate drum for years, right? Promises on emissions, green energy.
Absolutely. And in 2025, they recommitted to net zero by 2050 and renewed that pledge of $100 billion a year to help poorer nations adapt and go green.
Ah, the $100 billion pledge. This is where the sources jumped in again, isn't it?
It is. They point out, look, this isn't new. They first promised that back in 2009.
And the delivery.
According to the material, they've consistently failed to deliver the full amount year after year.
So a repeated promise, but not fully kept. Meanwhile, the climate crisis itself
is accelerating. The sources stress. They mention we're on track for maybe 2.5 degrees Celsius warming by 2100. That's way above the 1.5 degree target from the Paris Agreement, the one scientists say we need to hit.
And we're already seeing impacts. Extreme weather costing billions, displacing millions, often hitting developing nations hardest.
Right. So the sources ask, how effective are these pledges if the problem keeps getting worse?
And the critique also turns inward, towards the G7 nations themselves.
Very much so, pointing out they are among the biggest polluters, historically and currently.
Any specific example cited?
Yeah. The U.S. and Canada still pumping out oil and gas. Germany burning coal again because of the Russian gas situation. Japan restarting nuclear plants while talking renewables.
The analogy used there was
like a smoker lecturing you about lung health while lighting up a cigarette. Pretty pointed.
And for you, the listener, this connects to higher energy costs, weirder weather, a future where maybe a beach vacation looks very different. The sources take. Pledges without real matching action are just hot air.
Okay, final big area from the sources. Trade wars. They look at the G7 saying one thing, free and fair trade, but doing another.
And the big example they focus on is the U.S. under President Trump's second term, starting Jan 2025. Tariffs making a comeback.
Exactly. They highlight India facing new U.S. duties on things like steel, spices, mentioning Trump calling India one of the highest tariffing nations.
And India hit back.
Swiftly, according to the sources. Retaliatory tariffs on U.S. cars. Whiskey. Described as a playground fight, but with billions of dollars at stake.
So amidst this tariff tango, the G7 in 2025 promised to do what?
To strengthen global trade rules, promote open markets.
But the sources see that as difficult, or maybe hypocritical.
Both, really. They point to the bigger picture. China, not in the G7, flooding markets with cheap goods, which hurts Western industries.
But G7 nations still buy loads of Chinese stuff, right? Tech, especially.
Exactly. And poorer nations get caught in the middle of all this.
So for you, the listener, the connection is...
Pricier gadgets, clothes, cars. The sources basically say, blame the tariff tango. The feeling conveyed is that the G7 is too busy with internal squabbles and finger-pointing, especially at China, to really fix global trade.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together. What's the source material's main explanation for why the G7, in their view, keeps dropping the ball on all these huge issues?
The core argument, running through everything, seems to be this. They're more interested in looking good than doing good.
Image over substance.
Pretty much. The summits are portrayed as a stage, leaders show strength, score points back home, but maybe dodge real accountability. The sources call it a bonfire of vanities.
Strong words, focusing on the optics, the handshakes, the photos, the long communiques.
That nobody reads, according to the sources. Full of jargon, maybe, but not leading to action.
And this clashes with the kinds of problems we face. Problems that need actual cooperation.
Deep cooperation, yeah. Climate change, pandemics, you can't solve those alone. But the sources suggest real cooperation means sharing power, compromising. And that's the G7's kryptonite. Each nation wants to lead, which gets in the way of working together effectively.
And that theme of hypocrisy keeps coming up.
Repeatedly. Condemning Russia but finding ways to buy its oil. Promising Gaza aid while arming Israel. Climate pledges while drilling more. It's this double talk, the sources argue, that just breeds cynicism and kills trust.
Okay, but despite this really critical view, the material does end with, well, not exactly optimism, but maybe a glimmer of hope.
It does shift tones slightly. It suggests that maybe the G7's perceived failures are actually sparking a broader conversation about needing change.
Like reforming global institutions.
Right. Ideas like expanding the G7 to include countries like India or Brazil, or maybe giving more weight to the G20. They mentioned India's G20 presidency in 2024 pushing for reforms of the UN. It's seen as a long shot, maybe, but a positive sign that people are thinking about alternatives.
And pressure from below, activists, protests.
Yeah, the sources mention grassroots movements, climate activists, farmers in Europe demanding real action, not just summit declarations.
Technology, too, as a force for change outside the G7 process.
Cheaper solar and wind, AI helping with things like food supply, solutions that might just need governments to get out of the way rather than lead from the top.
And finally, it comes back to the individual, to you listening. The sources say G7 promises might not change the world, but your choices can matter. How you vote, consume, advocate.
And there's a final, almost throwaway line suggesting maybe we cut the G7 some slack, acknowledging these problems are just incredibly hard to solve in today's world.
So, wrapping up our dive into this material, the picture of the 2025 G7 summit is one of, well, maybe good intentions, but ultimately, according to these sources, bad outcomes or just not enough progress.
Yeah, the big global challenges, wars, climate, trade, they persisted, met by what the sources call that recycled script of sanctions, pledges, and posturing.
The core message seems to be leadership is about results, not photo ops or catchy slogans.
And they leave us with that stark image, the bonfire of vanities, suggesting until that changes, until there's real tough action.
The world's problems will just keep piling up.
And as the sources bluntly put it, we'll all pay the price.
So their final challenge to you, listening, is pretty direct. Next time you see a G7 headline, don't just shrug.
Ask the hard questions the sources raise. What's this actually doing for Ukraine, for Gaza, for the climate, for your wallet?
In the world described here, the sources seem to think the G7 has a remarkable knack for self-delusion.
Let's hope, despite this critical assessment, that meaningful change isn't entirely out of reach.